First of all, I would like to thank a lot the Central Staff and everybody here and take more time than my presentation to thank everybody what to thank. And just to say that is a great pleasure and even greater honor to be in the same room and same people as my bibliography, from which I learned a lot from you. You're not responsible for the part I did not learn, but thank you very much. And I want to also apologize profusely to Professor Bacci, because I did not finish my paper, and I thought the lesser bad was to send a mass of confused notes to him, then free him to make general comments on the topic and not to bother with my presentation. But I'm really sorry I managed to finish. But what I want to talk today is about two things. On one hand, the title of the paper is Elements of Continuity and Change in International Economic Order, and analysis based on a modern classical circular approach. I think that's why it's taking so long to finish the thing, because I have done already work on the more, let's say, empirical part, in which the analytical part was more or less implicit or relegated to the footnotes because of the audience. And then I was even asked to be more explicit here, so I stopped in the middle. It's a bit messy, but I'll try to be very schematic, but remember the time is short and we can discuss stuff later. But go directly to the point is that my purpose is to provide at least the beginning of interpretation based on the modern classical approach of some important aspects of the international economic order in the 2000s. Some of it is already happening for a long time. Some are new trends that I think will prevail. So it is just a very stylized thing. And the main point here is not the empirical stuff, it's the kind of interpretation of what's going on. Now it can go for hours for the example. It's a very broad brush and it's supposed to be so. It's a very broad issue. Now, I will discuss very briefly three things which are part of a bigger research project of a number of people in my university and also with friends in Argentina. Okay, so now the element of continuity, let me be blunt, in the 2000s is what I call the floating dollar standard. It is still here, it's not in crisis, and it's going to continue for some time. Which I mean the only really international currency is the US dollar. The other, and I want to talk about two elements which I think have changed from the beginning of the 2000s, not now. First is a relative, a partial decoupling of the growth rates of a large number of developing countries relative to the growth rates of the developed advanced countries. And the second, it's connected thing, it's not the same. A reversal in the trend of the terms of trade of primary commodities, which as Professor Roncalli mentioned here, historically, traditionally were going against primary food and inputs. Now this attitude takes one continuous change. I'll be extremely fast on that. And to show the difference between the modern classical approach and the kind of analysis we can do that, I also mentioned a development, a very important development economist, which is Arthur Lewis, to show how he was the more explicit analytical of the development economy. I want to show very quickly how he was led, according to himself, to a classical approach, which is something that parallels things that happened in the 20s with Zara. He said, from my undergraduate days, I had sought the solution to the question of what determines the international relative price of steel and coffee, of the products of rich and developing countries. The approach through marginal utility made no sense to me. Another problem that troubled me was storage. Apparently, during the first 50 years of the Industrial Revolution, real wages in Britain remained more or less constant, while profits means the profit rate, share, and so its savings also. This could not be squared with the neoclassical framework in which a rise in investment should raise wages, of course if there's free point, and depress the rate of return of capital. Now, the funny thing is this one. One day in almost 1952, walking down the road in Bangkok, it came to me suddenly that both problems have the same solution. Throw away the neoclassical assumption of the quantity of labor employed is fixed. An unlimited supply of labor will keep wages down, producing cheap coffee in the first case and high profits in the second. In the sense, the wages are different in the two regions, right? So he got that connection about the technical conditions of production and distribution. In this case, not only the real wage in one country and the other. And he used a very simple ratio, which is the output per worker of the capitalist sector versus the output per worker of the informal, non-capitalist, peasant agricultural sector to determine the wage share. And at the same time, looking at specific prices, the unit labor costs of the different countries. Of course, it's a very simplified thing, but it showed that development economics needed to go the classical way. This is the origin of his famous article, The Limited Supply, Development and Limited Supply, according to himself. Now, the interesting thing is that we are using an approach that is based on, in a way, this kind of development, but it's what I call modern classical approach. It means it has to be after disruption. Disruption's little book, as they call it, he did, as you all know, this clarified the general relations between distribution, technical conditions of production, and relative prices in a classical framework. And, of course, what matters to us is that contrary to Lewis, that did not have this analytical framework present, he did not need, after Israel, nobody needs, not even Lewis, to say that there is an infinitely elastic supply of labor. He himself says, no, the wages in the scientists, he said, no, that all it means is the wages exogenous, depends on other things. It's not the shape of a Machiavellian firm. And also, there is no need also to restrain the argument to the conditions implying the labor theory value, or even worse, to the so-called Ricardian models of trade, that the only scarce factor is labor. So the advantage of the modern approach is that this results is on the relative prices and distribution, generalized approach, and the clarification of the analytical structure, the separation of prices and quantities, and the clarification that says, well, it's not necessary for accumulation, because you see, Lewis was saying profits, high profits meant high savings, high growth, it's not necessary. Allows us to introduce effective demand in the long medium, even beyond in the process of accumulation. And the other thing is that this modern approach, by getting rid of such law, opens also, of course, for a monetary determination on the rate of interest. This will be very important to what you say here, especially the fact that it is not only the short-term safe interest rate determined by the central bank, but the long-term safe interest rate is not determined by liquidity prices. It's determined in a great part by what the market expects the central bank will do. And therefore, monetary policy does have a very strong influence on the long rates of interest also that are not immediately set by the central bank. This is very important to understand. And of course, it opens the door also for cost-push inflation and particularly balance of payments constraint. Cost-push inflation for the obvious conflict over distribution and the fact that you now don't have employment all the time, the things, but also balance of payments constraint that come from the fact, apart from all the contributions around it's very important variable that we have to talk about here very briefly, that the real exchange rate is assumed in traditional balance of payment theories to be fully flexible, both in the sense that it goes in the right direction and sufficiently to equilibrate the balance of payments. Now, the two problems here is that being the real exchange rate a distributive variable, it might not move enough. And there's another problem, which is that we'll not enter here, but especially with free capital movements, it can easily go the wrong direction.